from Benton County, so I was not sure what to expect today. My husband had told me it was a game day, but do you want me to go ahead and get started? Okay. My name is LaDonna Humphrey. I'm the author of 2 books. The first book is called The Girl I Never Knew, and my second book, which I'm here to talk about today, is called Strangled. And I think what I'll do is maybe do a little bit of history on The Girl I Never Knew, and then just kind of talk about why I ended up writing Strangled. So for the past 8 years, I have worked alongside investigators in Fort Smith, Arkansas, to help solve a cold case of a 19-year-old girl who was kidnapped from Bowling World on December 1st, 1994. Her name was Melissa Witt, and her body was found 45 days later, about an hour from the abduction site in the Ozark National Forest. And what started this journey for me is that I have a background in nonprofit, and we had actually been a part of a nonprofit where we assisted law enforcement with missing adult cases. So we would travel across the United States and help train smaller law enforcement agencies on how to respond to missing adults cases, and we would work with the families and act as a liaison. There was a lot that went into that, and we did that for about a decade and a half. And really in the early to mid 2000s, there was a government database that launched called NamUs. And that database essentially exists for unidentified and missing persons. And of course, it's funded by the federal government. And so our job wasn't needed anymore. You know, you want to work yourself out of a nonprofit if you can. You know, you don't want to just exist for the sake of existing. And so really what we wanted to do is to finish strong and to finish with a documentary about the plight of missing adults in the United States. And I was very, very adamant that we needed to pick some cases that were in Arkansas that were long-term missing cases. And so we got a group together. It was our board of directors and our staff of the nonprofit. We sat around a table, and 11 people kept bringing up the Melissa Witt case. And what's so ironic about that is I was really adamant that we weren't going to cover that case. I said, no, they found her body. She's not missing. Why would we cover that case? I mean, and they outvoted me. Everybody was just so determined for me to at least go look at that case. And so that's how this started. I went to meet with investigators, and they sort of tricked me when I got there. They had every retired detective in the room that had ever worked her case that was really passionate about the case, and I was convinced that we had to cover the case, and that's really what started this. You know, they took me out to the site where they found Melissa's body, and that changed my life. You know, I'm a mom. I have 5 girls, 2 boys, and being out on that mountainside knowing that somebody felt like they had the right to take Melissa's life and then to leave her there like she didn't mean anything to anybody changed my life, and I made a vow to try to bring exposure to her case so law enforcement could solve the case and bring her some justice. And so through that process, I became a PI, and I started consulting with law enforcement on the case. And so we're 8 years in. And during COVID, everybody was at home, you know, we're on lockdown. And it became very difficult for us to finish the documentary because of COVID. And I did not want to be stagnant in the case. And so I decided to write a book. And that's really kind of, as people get to know me, when I decide I'm going to do something, then that's what I'm going to do. And you know, I was very fortunate to have several publishers, excuse me, that were interested. And then I wrote The Girl I Never Knew, and it was published, and that has become a bestseller since then. And so during the time that I was writing The Girl I Never Knew, I was about three or four chapters in, and a tip came forward to our tip line about the Witt case. And this is where book 2 comes into play. And I can tell you where I was at that day. I can tell you what kind of coffee I was wearing, what I was drinking, what I was wearing. And this tip comes in from a young woman who tells us that she's from the Portland, Oregon area, and that back in 2009, that she had been working in the adult entertainment industry. And that she had been asked to be a part of a film There was no sex involved, but to be a part of a film where she was to play like she was dead wearing a Mickey Mouse watch. And that really piqued our interest because the filmmaker wanted her to wear this watch. It was critical to the film, and she was made up like she had been strangled. And in the Melissa Witt case, Melissa had been strangled, and she had been wearing a Mickey Mouse watch when she was kidnapped, and investigators never found that watch. They believed that it was kept as some sort of trophy memento for the killer. And so this was new to us. You know, when you work a cold case, lots and lots of information comes in, and it's usually repetitive, almost always. And what we'd seen in the Witt case is that some of the legends in her case, so to speak, about her being involved with drugs or other things are constant tips that we receive. And so when this tip came in, it was different. And we were really, really concerned about why somebody would be making a film like that and why it was so much like the Witt case. And so what happened through that, by then I'd already had my PI license, and I went to go meet with investigators, and we interviewed the young woman over the phone that had called in the tip. And she seemed reliable. She was very scared. And there were some elements of her story that we knew, yes, that would be great, that we knew that we could check on, verify. And so after that interview, investigators asked me to get to know her. And so I did. I spent a lot of time doing that. And it was decided that we would find the film and that we would also try to find the producer that made the film. And so this opened up an entire world of trying to understand what the dark web is and to understand that there are people out there that live in this little world on the internet that's dark and dreadful, and they glorify the murder of women, particularly young women. It was really hard to digest. I didn't know that this existed, but it's called death fetish. And to think that that had something to do with Melissa's case was frightening to me, but we knew we had to do something about it. And one of the things that happened, and I write about in Strangled, is that we found that film. And after months and months of work, we found the film. And it was so striking how much the young woman in the film looked like Melissa Witt and the elements of the film itself that we had to push forward. And through that investigation, we found the producer, and I catfished him. Do you know what catfishing is? Some people don't. And I posed as someone else with the assistance of law enforcement, and I ended up being his love interest. And that was really strange for me because, one, I'd never done anything like that before, but two, we knew we had to get the information out of this producer because if he didn't have any connection to Arkansas and some valid details, we weren't going to continue to pursue this lead. And so I did that. And in chapter 4, it's called Into the Woods. And I'm going to read a little bit of that, if that's okay. You said you hadn't read Strangled yet. Okay. So a little bit of a spoiler. Okay. So I posed as a woman named Fawn Lane. Picked that name because that seemed very, adult entertainment-ish. Okay, so I chose to tell the producer, who we call Carl Coleman, I'm not using his real name, that I was going to be going on a vacation to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I could not answer him as frequently as I had been. So I'm going to start after I hang up the phone with J.C. Ryder, who was the original lead detective on the case. After Ryder and I said our goodbyes, I opened Fawn's Facebook account and typed another message to Carl. "Hey there," I wrote. "It just dawned on me that I forgot to tell you about my upcoming trip. For months now, I've been planning to attend a reunion with some of my sorority sisters from college." "That sounds like fun," Carl wrote. Where are you headed to, babe?" "The University of Arkansas in Fayetteville," I replied. Beautiful state, Carl answered. I absolutely loved it there. My heart raced as I processed the meaning of his words. You've been to Fayetteville, Arkansas, I asked. I have, Carl answered. I visited Fayetteville after passing through Ozark one year. Beads of sweat settled over my brow as I processed Carl's message. I could not believe what I was reading. I've never been to Ozark, but I've heard it's really beautiful there, I lied. It's gorgeous, he assured. I love the Ozark National Forest, and that scenic Highway 23 is to die for. Sheer terror pulsed through my veins as I instinctively covered my mouth to muffle the scream that was rising in my throat. State Highway 23, also known as the Pig Trail, is a 19-mile stretch that passes through the Ozark National Forest and boasts every kind of scenery one can imagine, from mountain views to waterfalls. But Highway 23 is known for more than just its gorgeous views. It's also one of only 2 routes that leads to the location where Melissa Witt's body was discovered. My emotions collapsed under the weight of Carl's admission, causing my mind to spontaneously conjure up those gruesome crime scene images from that rainy January day in 1995 when Melissa's body was discovered in the Ozark National Forest. As my terror slowly turned to anger, I shouted with fury at the computer screen. What did you do, Carl Coleman? What did you do? And that was a pivotal point for us because now he's placed himself not only in Fayetteville, Arkansas, but he's placed himself in Ozark. And so Strangled really is the story that Alecia and I write together of our journey into not only looking into this tip and trying to find out the identity of the producer, which we did, but we did a deep dive into the world of death fetish. And, under, guise of these are my screen names, I use a VPN, everything that you can imagine to protect yourself. And the people in the dark web still were able to find out who I was. And I write about how they doxed me in the death fetish community, and there are these forums where they talk about the glorification of murder of young women, and they gave out my address, my home address, my name, where I work, everything that you can imagine about me, and that was terrifying for me. We were successful in being able to get that information removed, but as you know, the world of screenshots and everything else, it was too late. And so really I had to make a vow then that not only was I going to continue to pursue the Melissa Witt case, I was also going to try to pursue shutting down the death fetish communities, because there are state laws and there are federal obscenity laws, and many of those are being broken in these communities. And I'm not going to get into graphic detail. I mean, there's more detail in the book about what's going on, and you can probably use your imagination to think about how horrible that was. So many things that have come out of this is we still don't have definitive answers if Carl Coleman did kill Melissa Witt. That's still under investigation. Because I was doxxed in the community, there are several of the death fetish websites that went offline. They realized they were under investigation, and they've shut down. And then what was born out of that was a bigger effort to make people aware that this is happening, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of movies that are a part of these communities. Many of them are depicting murders, real murders. No snuff films that we came across, but it's simulated murder. And so that was concerning because, one, do they have more information about real murders like Melissa Witt? Are they just obsessed with murder, and so they learn about these cold cases and they make movies like them? It's possible. But it was an angle of the case that we really, really had to track down for Melissa. And I'd like to kind of open it up to questions, because that's more fun for me and I think for the audience to ask questions. So let's start there, and that way I can tell you a little bit more about the book. You got any questions? Yeah.
I was going to ask you if this did pertain to the snuff film type fetish, because some of those were found to be real, and others were found to be, just theatrics. But I'm curious, he started out in California, the way you found him, he was producing out there?
In Oregon, yes.
Oregon. And same thing.
And they have no state they have no state obscenity laws. They did away with that. Oregon did. But it's still federally illegal to sell these films. But it's on a case-by-case basis whether they are going to be held accountable for the content of the film. And to answer your question, two things came out of this. Is that one, although we don't know if we ever found a real snuff film, some of them look pretty real, okay? We did try to spend some time tracking down the models that were in the films, especially in the films that concerned us the most, and we weren't able to find all of them. But we did find postings within the forums from producers that say things like, well, the best models in these movies, you know, they only get to make one movie. You know, things that would make you feel like there's more to it. But the other thing that we found, and I was concerned about, because, you know, when you see these websites going down because they're scared they're being investigated, what's going on in those communities? And one of the things that we do know is that they, and when I say they, we call them the fetishers, they often, all across the United States, are able to traffic dead bodies, which is very scary to think about, but because necrophilia is a huge theme here. But they also pay morgues, ambulance, you know, EMT drivers, you know, all sorts of people who might be on the scene of an accident, especially a fatality, and they purchase those photos and they put them on websites such as Real Dead Guys. You know, some of them are so horrible I'm not going to mention them. So we know that there are crimes being committed. It's not a crime that most people probably understood. And, you know, for me personally, I'm a mom of 7. I happen to love true crime, and I'm passionate about Melissa Witt's case. But this was too much for me. It really was. I started seeing a counselor pretty early on to deal with the things that I've seen and read. And I'm not actively in the forums anymore. We've turned all of that over to law enforcement at this point. That's really their job at this point. But it's difficult. And so, yeah, there are real terrible things that are going on. And it's often hard to tell what is real and what is acting in these films. And that's what I feel very passionate about, is that we shine a light on that so we can put a stop to it. Because even if the world of death fetish didn't have anything to do with Melissa Witt's case, it's still the glorification of murder. And we know that when you spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours viewing violent pornography, that you are much more apt to participate in real crimes, sexual assault, you know, murder, those type of things. And I want to give you an example, because one of the things that we write about in the book and we found is that there was a woman in the UK named Jane Longhurst, and her best friend's fiance was a fetisher, and she didn't know it. And she ended up being with him that day to go swimming. They were all good friends. His name was Graham Coots. And what she didn't know is that he was spending hours and hours and hours every day on places like Dead Skirts, Femme Fatalities, Death, you know, darkfetishnet.com. And he was really into strangulation and necrophilia. Well, what happened that day is that he strangled her to death, and he hid her body away in a storage unit. And the only day he didn't revisit her body was a day that he got locked out of the storage unit. And on that day, guess what he did? He had to get back online to those websites that I told you about. And I share that story because it's good evidence that he was so wrapped up in the world of necrophilia and rape and murder that if he couldn't experience it in his real life, the best fix that he could have was on the internet. And this is a danger to young women everywhere. And so my co-author, Alecia, who can't be here today, she had to fly home to the Virgin Islands. so we wrote the book together, but then we also launched a podcast called the Deep Dark Secrets Podcast. And our first season is about death fetish. We do a deep dive into pulling business licenses all across the United States of these men that are making these films. And we, for example, one of our episodes, we say, "Hi, Salem, Oregon. We want to tell you about a death fetish producer in your community, and his name is John Marshall." And we're giving the public information that they need to keep themselves safe. And I hope that we can help prevent murder in the future out of this community, not murder in general, but at least try to slow this down a little bit. And it's been a horrific journey, and one that I felt like we had to write about, even though it's a much darker topic than I think most want to be able to consume or to believe exists. So, but what else? What other questions? Oh, yeah.
I'm curious, what got you originally into the nonprofit? Was there something in your life, or?
There was. So when I was in 4th grade in Southwest Oklahoma, I was at a bowling alley one night with my dad. He bowled on a league, and a man came up and he kind of rammed into me on purpose. I didn't know it then. And it knocked my popcorn out of my hand, and he wanted to buy me more popcorn. That's how it started. And I was feisty back then, and I said, "No thanks." And I go and sit down. And what happens the rest of the night is he sits close enough to me that he can have a conversation, but far enough away that, an adult might not think anything was happening. And he convinced me that he knew my dad. And when my dad turned to wave at me and my sister, the man said, "See, I knew he was going to be glad to see me." And I believed him. My 4th grade self believed that my dad waved at all three of us. So he waited very patiently until my dad left the league to go into the restroom. And that's when he made his move, and he tried to lure me out of the parking lot. He didn't get very far. My dad came bolting out of the bathroom and saw that I was about to step outside the breezeway with some man, and then the rest is a blur for me. But he was not arrested for what he did to me because the crime had not yet been committed. But several months after this happened to me, the prosecutor's office called my family and said that he had lured another little girl and he had molested her, and they wanted me to testify against him. And so I did. And even as a little kid, I can remember feeling very empowered about that situation, because I learned, my childhood was shattered. I learned, I had lived in a really small town, maybe 200 people, a farming community. I didn't know what pedophilia was. I didn't know that adults could lie to you like that. I didn't know that little girls could get hurt. And I learned about that all really quickly. And I think that that's really was the catalyst for me for advocacy. And, I was a young woman when Morgan Nick went missing. And then I subsequently went to work as a volunteer for that agency. And through that is when I discovered that there was a real disparity in services for missing adults. And it was just a natural flow to go work for, the Morgan Nick Foundation, and then that kind of spilled into our advocacy work for adults. If somebody would have ever asked me, did you think you would ever be advocating for a cold case like you have for a significant amount of your life, I would have never thought that would be. But her case is completely solvable. I know that it is. And I feel like my job is to keep it on the forefront. And I think by talking about some of the things that we come across in this case, it's important because you can educate the community on what really happened to Melissa. Here are the true facts. If you remember anything, come forward. But you can also talk to young women as a whole about the dangers of understand your surroundings. Like Alecia. Yes, that was a great monetary opportunity for her to make that film, but she's lucky that she survived, and she should not have been a part of that. So it's those kind of things that we want to have open conversations about. So that's how it started for me, that ratty old bowling alley when I was in 4th grade. And, the guy that tried to kidnap me, his name was Bubba. And it's, his face is burned in my brain. And sometimes I see that face when I try to advocate for others, because I know what could have happened to me. I'm glad I didn't. I know you said you had a question too.
Do you think, you said that some people found out that you were just catfishing this producer. Do you think he started that in motion, like trying to find out if you were real or not? Or do you think that they monitor people who are talking with, producers, actors, directors?
Well, what happened, I don't think he knew who Fawn Lane was. I think he thought that Fawn was going to be able to be groomed into making films for him. Because one of the things that these particular producers like to do is to get an innocent looking girl, not a porn star looking girl. They want somebody innocent to be in these films. And one of the places that they go to is social media. Other is, believe it or not, like domestic abuse shelters. I mean, it's horrible, some of the things they do. But so the answer is yes and no. And I write about this. One of the things that Carl Coleman asked Fawn to do was to go and join an online community called Fête Noire. And it was a community that he had, it was a website he had built. And he wanted me to talk to his longtime friend, Grace. And of course I did it because we wanted to see what was in Fête Noire. That was a gated death fetish community. Well, it turns out he's really Grace. So there's that. But Fête Noire had the capability to pull back my VPN once I became a member, and they got me. So that's when my identity was compromised. And so I had to pretty quickly get the information I needed and shut that down with Carl. Now, since then, I've reached out to Carl, it's not his name, as LaDonna. So he's quite aware of the investigation, and he's not cooperative in the least. So, and it's scary. It is not something, we give a disclaimer at the first of the book. And I'm going to say that, especially since we're live streaming this, because I don't want people to go out and start Googling these things. But it says, disclaimer, in order to protect ourselves and others, there are instances where the names of people and locations have been changed. Furthermore, we do not encourage or condone research or participation in the dark web or the death fetish pornography industry without the consent of law enforcement, access to a therapist, and the proper equipment to prevent your personal information from being hacked. To ignore this warning is to proceed at your own risk. Because we knew that, we talked about this, before this started, there are just diehard true crime addicts out there who are going to want to learn more, and it's not safe. And so we definitely didn't want to condone it, but we also felt like we needed to talk about it. One, because it is part of Melissa's case. But two, the only way we can combat this is to talk about it and to shine a light on it and to let people know that it exists. But the only way I could protect myself, because I've been doxxed in the community, is to write this book and to do the podcast and to be as brave as I can be. There's some wisdom behind the decisions I'm making, and law enforcement is well aware of what's going on. But those are part of the reasons why I had to do it. Once I was doxxed, that's pretty scary. Yeah. A good example is my day job is I'm a sober living director for women, and I run 2 houses in Bella Vista, and that's what I do full time. And I went to a conference in Jonesboro that had nothing to do with the Witt case. It's about sobriety and addiction. And they buzzed me in my room to come down to pick up something at the front desk. And I was a little surprised because I'm only in Jonesboro for a couple of days, and my husband isn't going to send me anything. And I go downstairs, and there were some flowers that were sent to me, and it was from a member of the death fetish community. Then I go to CrimeCon in Vegas, and they do the same thing to me there. And so they're bullies somewhat. A lot of these people are keyboard warriors, right? And I understand that. But there's going to be a small percentage of them that are going to do more than that. And so that kind of amped it up for me, wanting to be able to take a bigger stand against them. And this is the best way, the best way that we can do it. What else? Yeah. Sure.
You said that you're going to write a third book in this series, so what direction are you going with that one?
Well, I'm going to read you the epilogue. Can I do that? Okay. I'm excited about the next book because I believe there's so much to say about this. And the reality, before I read this, the reality is that Melissa knew her killer. She just did. Whether she knew him very well or they had only been recently acquainted, she knew her killer. And there's just some information that we have that leads us to believe that. And so there's a really, great possibility that this next book is really going to touch on who really did kill her. But we had to look at the death fetish community because there was a possibility that this guy, he came to Arkansas and he got to know Melissa, and that happens all the time. You look at the murder of Melissa Trotter in 1998 in Texas. She met her killer not even a week prior, and he'd asked her on dates, and they'd talked a lot. And so when you're 19 and you meet a cute boy, you talk a lot. Often in person, because this was the 90s. You didn't have the cell phones and internet and those things then. So it's really, really possible that she could have come across a guy like this that she met at a gas station or, a Chick-fil-A or something like that. So, but I think most likely it was someone that Melissa had dated. That's what I believe. So I will read this to you. And I'm so blind without my glasses, so I have to put these on. It's an age thing, guys. I'm almost 50. It's like my eyesight went. Monday started off as a typical day. I made breakfast, dropped the kids off at school and daycare, grabbed my morning coffee from the Starbucks drive-thru, and ventured onto my job as a sober living director. As I walked into the office that morning, my assistant, Cindy, gave me a knowing look. "Good morning, LaDonna," she offered cheerily. "I left a few things on your desk." "Morning," I called back as I rounded the corner to my office. Just a few things, I thought. To myself as I pushed the door open, my jaw dropped as I glanced inside the cramped room. My desk was covered with a mountain of paperwork. Drug screen results, mail, court requests, applications, and discharge reports demanded my immediate attention. Glancing at my watch, I slumped into my black leather office chair. "Cindy," I called out wearily, "I'm not taking any walk-in appointments today, okay?" Moments later, Cindy cautiously peered into my office and smiled. "Got it," she said as she pointed to the tower of paperwork. "More coffee?" "Please," I answered dully as I dove into the sea of paperwork. Minutes later, Cindy returned with a steaming cup of Java. "Thank you so much," I offered between sips as Cindy plopped down in the worn-out chair across from me. "I know you're not taking walk-in appointments," she started off, "but there is a woman waiting out front to see you. She just arrived, and she seems very distraught." I raised my eyebrows as I thumbed through the large pile on my desk. "Okay, send her in," I sighed. As Cindy left to retrieve the woman from the lobby, I gulped down half of my coffee. I made a lame attempt at restacking the papers on my desk and stood to my feet, just as Cindy guided a well-dressed woman into my office. "Hi, LaDonna," she said as I stood to greet her. "Thank you for seeing me today." "Of course," I answered as I leaned across my desk to shake her hand. "How can I help you?" I asked. Cindy gently closed my office door behind her as I settled back into my chair. My guest took a seat and she smiled as she pointed at my desk. "Should I come back later?" I laughed. "To be honest, I would rather meet with you than wade through this mess. What can I help you with today?" I asked. "Are you a family member struggling with a drug addiction?" No, she half yelled in response. "No, it's nothing like that. I'm here for a different reason. I need to," and her voice trailed off. "Can you tell me why you're so upset?" "I'm here to discuss the Melissa Witt case," she whispered. She looked down at her well-manicured hands. "And I'm sorry to show up here like this, but I wanted to meet with you in person." So there's some details here that I'm not going to give that are kind of a spoiler, so I'm going to kind of skip to the end. She said, "I was walking back to my car that night in the Bowling World parking lot," she explained, "and I could hear them fighting." "You could hear who fighting?" "Melissa, and I think the man who killed her. I still remember the sound of his voice. Despite my racing heart, I remained calm as I tossed the wet paper towels in the trash can near my desk. Could you hear what Melissa said? Could you hear Could you hear her say his name? I remembered that his name started with, she sobbed, his name started with the letter, and I struggled to keep my composure the moment the letter of his first name left her lips. I took a deep breath. I couldn't bring myself to tell her that a man whose name that is well known to Witt investigators also starts with the same letter. I want to do something, she cried. With some help, I think I could remember more details from that night at Bowling World. What kind of help do you think you need? I asked as our eyes locked. I want help remembering his name, she said. I want to be hypnotized. Now, hypnosis, and I bet you know this, you're retired law enforcement, right? It's not admissible in court. This particular witness has been hypnotized before, but we did hypnotize her again just on Monday, actually. And so I'm really excited about this information. It's really got everybody, we've met with investigators 3 times last week. So I think it's going to be crucial to the case. I think that this, if you follow our Facebook page, you'll see that we just released some information that this particular witness remembered from the parking lot that night, and we're trying to find those people. So I'm excited about that. And so that 3rd book is going to be called Hypnotized, and it's going to be the journey of hypnosis. I'm going to talk a little bit about hypnosis historically and how that's contributed to other cases. And then we're going to deep dive into what we call the unnamed suspect, whose name has never been released to the public. We still won't release it, but we're going to talk about why we think he could be our guy. And hopefully, in the very near future, we'll have some closure to this case. So it felt like this should naturally spill into that because both are such critical parts of the case. And I'm really, really hopeful that we'll have some answers. So I think you said yes.
Something came to mind, the little girl has been missing from the baseball field, softball field down in Fort Smith for X number of years,
Yes.
and they thought they had a suspect, not really sure, some quote-unquote hillbilly looking guy driving a truck. Have you ever had any involvement in that, or lent any of your expertise in solving that one?
No, I did work with investigators on the Witt side of it because there was some belief for a while that, so Melissa goes missing, her body's found in January, about 45 days later, and then 6 months later, Morgan Nick goes missing. And so there was some concern that maybe those 2 abductions could be related. And they could be. It's pretty rare to find a predator that would just be so opportunistic that he would take an adult or a child. Typically, you've got a pedophilia situation or you have someone, yeah, exactly. So from our end of things, we don't think that they're connected. And I don't believe the Alma police thinks they're connected either. And so I've not spent as much time on the Nick case, although my heart goes out to that family. The level of involvement that I have in the Witt case, pretty much, it's a full-time job almost at this point. So, and people ask me, are you gonna, after these books are out, are you gonna take on another case? I probably will, but it'll be similar to Melissa's. One of the things that we did do because of the Witt case is that we started a new nonprofit, and it's called All the Lost Girls, and it was formed in her honor. And essentially, that nonprofit will take on cases that are almost identical to Melissa's, and we're going to help pay for DNA testing and other things that could be important to help solve those cold cases. So I'll be spending a good portion of my time doing that. And the proceeds of my first book, I don't take any money from the books. The proceeds for the first book will go to DNA testing in Melissa Witt's case. And the proceeds from this book are going to help fund our journey to stop the death fetish community. So it's important to me that that I'm not profiting off of this tragedy. So, and I'm so sorry, I'm going to turn this off. My kiddos keep texting me. What else? What other questions?
That actually leads to my other question, and don't say anything personal, obviously, but I'm just curious because you say you have 7 kids. Are you able to feel like they're safe?
And you're safe.
As a mother, I know you're more concerned with them as much as yourself.
I am concerned with them. We've definitely changed the way that we live our life. And in The Girl I Never Knew, I wrote about an incident where I was in the grocery store, and so my 2 oldest children are adults, they're biological, and then I've adopted 5 children out of the foster care system. And 2 of them were tiny. One was in a baby carrier. And so I have, the 5 little kids with me, and a man is following us in the store. And it's making my kids nervous, but I'm thinking, I don't think he's following us. That was my attitude. Well, it turns out he was. He approached me and he said, "You're the Witt lady." And I said, "This is not the time or the place. How can I help you at another time or place? But it won't be today. Back off from my kids." And he sticks his hands in his pockets, which of course I'm starting to get super nervous. I yell out to another shopper, "Call the police," because I think this is going to go bad really quick. And he pulls out these old Mickey Mouse watches, and he tries to give them to me. And I said, "No, back away from my family." And he throws them into my cart, and he runs out of the store. And so I am freaking out at this point, because he mentions in the conversation that he had been watching us since we'd had ice cream, which was 2 hours prior to this. And I knew then that there was no going back from being so public in this case, and we had to take some measures that could involve security. I don't ever put on social media where I'm going to be until after the fact if I want to talk about it. These events make me nervous, especially, the last couple events we had several hundred people attend, and that makes me nervous. But we try to be very careful. I typically have undercover security, and there's somebody here today. He's just not in the room. So he'll be here to make sure I get to my car. But those are things that are new that I had to do. I don't buy groceries anymore. I don't go shopping at the mall if I'm not with my husband. I don't get to do some of the things that I used to do. But that's what happens when you get involved in a cold case. And I had not ever wanted my name to be attached to this case. When we started the documentary, I gave an interview to a newspaper, and I'm not going to punk them out in this because we work with them still. They feel bad about it. But I asked them not to use my name, and they did, and they used a huge photo of me with the article. And that's when I started getting letters from inmates. That's when it starts. And it's too late. You can't go back and undo that. So, but yes, so we have special security at our house. I don't ever go out in the public anymore. I did go to CrimeCon without security, and I'll never do that again because that was pretty scary. And then, of course, eventually I'll come to the place where I'm not going to work in the field that I work in now as my day job, because it's just, this has become a full-time career for me, but it's just not safe anymore. And so one of the things that I do try to do is to teach people who want to advocate for a cold case to think about those things, the consequences, because I've had to trade off some things that people take for granted that I can't do anymore. So not super happy about it. My kids they don't go to public school. They'll never go to public school. My adult children, I just don't let them be connected to me. They actually have a different name. And one of them doesn't even live in this country right now. So, yeah, it's scary, especially because of the death fetish community, because they're everywhere. They could be a doctor, a judge, a lawyer, and they are. And there's about 100,000 people at any given time that are a part of the death fetish community. And, right now they're taking a stand against us, saying that we are discriminating against a minority group. They're not a minority group. They're not a protected minority group. And we're also not discriminating against people who have some sort of kink in the bedroom. That's not what this is at all. But if you go on our social media, you'll see all their tacky comments. And it's scary. I mean, we leave them for the most part because I feel like that speaks to their character. and people are going to understand what we're dealing with. But they are just so adamantly afraid that we're going to put a dent in what they're doing, and we're going to. We already have. I mean, when we launched the podcast, we went from 0 to several thousand listeners to being on the charts in Ireland within a month. And so people are curious to learn about death fetish. And we're just two moms, and I think that makes it a little bit interesting for people. So, yes.
I'm sorry, I apologize, I came in late.
No, you're fine.
So maybe you already answered this question, but I wanted to ask, what is the death fetish community, and what do they do?
So they...
quickly, so I know more.
Yeah, it's online communities. They meet in gated online communities, and they gain sexual gratification by describing murder, the murder of young women. They post pictures and stories and make movies, and it's pretty horrific. Now, they'll tell you it's all fantasy. Guys, I'm so sorry. This is horrible that it's on live stream, but I'm going to tell them to quit texting me. Okay. She has, my youngest daughter had a soccer game. And so they spend a lot of and I say they, we call them the fetishers. I think the least that we've tracked, some of these people spending online a couple hours a day. Some of them spend all day in these forums. And some of the forums you can get into that aren't gated, and that you can see they freely talk about me or Alecia Lockhart. We're a pain in their side, and we didn't intend for that to happen the way that it did, but we're here, and so we have to deal with it. And I asked my husband, do you want me to quit? And he said, well, you can't, because they already know you, and so now you're just going to be brave, and we're just going to push forward. And so that's what we're trying to do. And our podcast, the first season will end in a few months, and then we go on to a different topic. But we're not going to stop trying to change the laws surrounding death fetish, because necrophilia is a mental illness. It's in the DSM-5. It's not something normal. It's not healthy. And it's, we want to see these people get the mental health care that they need so they don't go on to commit these crimes. And one of the things that our podcast covers are all the murders that have come out of the death fetish community. You will be shocked to know that this is happening. And we just cannot let it continue. We just, to the best of our ability, we're going to do what we can within our power to at least expose it and maybe get some other people to link arms with us so we can say no more. But if you Google death fetish, well, now my name comes up with some of it because I've written about it, which makes it interesting. But if you Google it, and we don't want people to do that, but even a Google search that's not within the dark web pulls stuff up. It's horrible. It's really horrible. Yeah.
I learned quickly through a lecture from an old sage guy that gave a presentation at the police academy that I went through in Las Vegas. And it was something that was almost a constant reminder to me as I went through what I did in law enforcement, the various aspects of law enforcement I worked in. But I'll never forget that he brought up a comment that said and his specialty was child sex crimes, that specifically. And he showed some videos that had been confiscated and been used as evidence to kind of give us that shock treatment that you need, that awakening of what you're in for. And that was the whole purpose of it, was to give you a taste of that. So if you think you want to go into that line of work, this is what you're going to see.
Yeah.
So he made a comment that when you awaken the sexual curiosity of a child, you've awakened it forever. And these people have, there's an undercurrent of all these forms, all crimes, and all forms of especially deviant crimes that we consider deviant behavior. And the first thing I learned was burglary. How we know that that's probably one of the most, larceny and burglary are one of the most pervasive crimes out there. And they're so casual that they're just, the courts just thumb their nose at them, okay, well, just, be a good boy for 6 months and we're done. And then he becomes a recidivist after that. And so burglary has a tendency to lead to home invasion, meaning entering the home when someone is there, especially after they've kind of stalked somebody where their curiosity just takes them into that lair. And then they suddenly, can work from that to rape and kidnap from there. A lot of people are abducted in those situations, and that's really how I learned about it in a situation when I was on patrol.
Wow.
And we ended up catching the guy, and he gave us a whole bunch of stuff.
Wow.
But that's what is going on here is this undercurrent of curiosity leading to some form of gratification, reinforcement of the gratification, and reinforcement of that gratification until it just bursts out of control, and they almost can't hide it. They have to be very good to hide this kind of stuff, and that's why they use the stark web. And I think it's great that you're pushing this out in any way you can, and hopefully other people will kind of follow suit on that.
I hope so. I mean, because, something that you're saying really resonates with me. I mean, there's just a fine line between fantasy and reality.
Absolutely. They consider it a reality.
And,
And everybody else is wrong.
There's a fetisher that has a Twitter account that's currently tweeting about me on a regular basis. I check it every now and then. And he talks about how stupid I am and how this is just fantasy and I don't know what I'm talking about. And, he wants me to read up on all these things that these, other therapists say about it. And you look up the therapists and they're fetishers too. They don't think there's anything wrong with necrophilia. And, there is something very dangerous about, and it wouldn't even have to just necessarily be death fetish, but you immerse yourself in something all day, every day, and you're going to want to do that, and it's going to lead to murder. And before we close, I'll read one more little section. If I may. As I have investigated the Melissa Witt case over the past 7 years, it's been 8 years now, I've encountered all kinds of evil, everything from psychopaths to serial murderers, and yet above all, the fetishers frighten me the most. Fear and dread have consumed my every waking moment since the day I discovered that dark, wicked part of the internet where the fetishers gather in secret to glorify the slaughter of innocent women. The terror I have endured from this experience has taken a toll on me, and as a result, I am plagued by a horrifying dream. I find myself standing in front of a giant television screen. As I stare into the grainy, flickering monitor, I can see a young woman running in a dark forest. As she sprints towards a large tombstone-like rock, a man suddenly emerges from the shadows. Without warning, he throws her to the ground like a rag doll. I tremble as the two wrestle on the rocky forest floor. I watch helplessly as this hulking man straddles the girl while she desperately fights for her life. Just as the man begins to wrap his calloused hands around her neck, he stops and jerks his head forward in an abrupt upward motion. I move closer to the screen, and through the static of the television, we make eye contact. Panic overtakes my body as reality sets in. He's watching me. Watch him. I stumble backward at the terrifying revelation. As I cower on the ground in fear, the man's maniacal laugh bursts through the television speakers. I scream and then jolt awake. It's clear that the collateral damage from our investigation into the death fetish community runs deep and wide. Our friends, our family, and the very fiber of our psyche will never ever be the same again. There is no doubt that the way women are depicted in violent pornography has real-life consequences. Frighteningly, the message that violence against women is sexy isn't relegated only to the dark corners of the internet. The narrative is ever so slowly seeping into the veins of mainstream media and promoting a disturbing message that the kidnapping, rape, and abuse of women is a normal part of a sexual relationship. And whether or not we choose to accept it, there are companies all across the world making millions of dollars selling that mantra. Even still, the undetected power of pornography sites, many of which promote a violent agenda against women, receive more visits, and I want you to let this sink in, they receive more visits each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. Those closest to me often ask how Alecia and I will ever recover from this horrifying journey. Each time I've been approached with this question, I've been unable to respond. But today, as I consider all of the sacrifices Alecia and I have made in our quest for justice, the answer seems obvious. We will wage war against this grisly and disgusting agenda that worships murder, gore, and mayhem. But Alecia and I can't do it alone. We need an army of advocates from coast to coast willing to link arms with us as we harness the power of social consciousness to defeat an evil that fantasizes about the torture and murder of women. We will kick down the walls of this dark and twisted community and expose their sadistic tendencies with a bright, unrelenting light. Even if the world of death fetish pornography is not responsible for the brutal murder of 19-year-old Melissa Witt, I cannot look away, and I will not walk away. I choose to stand and fight for Melissa and for every woman whose voice has been taken from them. This is how we will recover. And that's exactly how we feel. We just cannot. I mean, if you look at the research, and there's some of it that's in The Girl I Never Knew, my first book, and then there's some in this book, and you look at historically what, the FBI will tell you about violent offenders or people that they've arrested, and it all links back to violent pornography, every single bit of it. There's not been a case yet that hasn't. And it's the violence that they're promoting against women as normal, that's something that, they get in their communities and they say, hey, Joe, it's okay that you feel that way. I want to rape and murder somebody too. And hey, Chris, welcome. We're glad you're here. We're normal. We're going to be a support group for each other. And we're not going to talk about how we're going to prevent ourselves from acting on this. What we're going to talk about is how much we enjoy it and how we want to see this model, strangled and killed. And, before I close, I mean, we can do some more questions if you have some, but one of the things that they do is that they make custom films. So they can say, Bob can email a website and say, I want to see a redheaded, busty, 19-year-old girl get kidnapped, thrown in a white van, and strangled. And they can dictate what it looks like all the way through. It is, and they pay, these films go anywhere from $500 to $10,000. And these are people who are hungry for that content. And when that content is no longer good enough for them, what then? Are they going to be, that's why we have situations like Jane Longhurst, who was murdered by a death fetisher. Elaine O'Hara, who was brutally murdered by an architect who was a death fetisher. Sharon Lopatka, she was murdered. And then woman after woman after woman that I could give you their name, that was a case that was tied to the death fetish community. And so we take it very seriously, even though I know it's a tough topic to talk about. It's something that I think people need to know about. Can I answer any other questions? Yeah.
I had another one.
Sure.
Actually, I have a million, but.
Okay, ask.
So you said in your investigations you found out that some of the people who were really serious about these death fetish websites were in society very normal people.
Yes.
How in the world would you ever uncover that? I mean, that could be your relative, your spouse, your significant other. Like, how would you would never know. I mean.
You wouldn't. And, a good example of one is he was a cop in New York City. And he was going into these websites, and I don't know if he went by Meat Hunter Man or he was conversing with somebody called Meat Hunter Man, but they had talked about how they were going to kidnap and cook a female. They were going to eat her. So he's also known as the Cannibal Cop. And he had started acting funny at home, as you can imagine, as he's planning this, and his wife finds all the information on the internet. No. And oddly enough, his name is Gilberto Vale, and he friended me on Facebook. And I accepted it for about a minute, and then I realized he's probably still in that community. He got off. He is just walking free, wrote a book, and making money. And, you you would be surprised about the amount of police officers that have been involved, but it's not just police, it's doctors, it's judges, it's pediatrician, it could be your husband. You have to be aware of what's happening, and many times they don't find out about it until it's too late. For the architect that killed Elaine O'Hara, I can't think of his name right now, but he was having dozens of adulterous affairs with women that he was meeting through these death fetish sites, and then he would cut them and try to hurt them during their sexual encounters. And that went on unreported for years. And then he finally ended up killing Elaine O'Hara. And, it was too late. Nobody knew then. But sometimes what happens is that we've discovered that these fetishers will have disclosed this information, and it's usually around the age of 15 when this kind of starts happening for them. We see that it can be younger, but it's typically puberty, and they will disclose it sometimes to a parent or to a therapist. And back then, even in the 90s, nobody was really doing anything about it because, well, one, that's shocking, and what's a therapist going to do? You can't always talk about what's been said in a session. And so I think the way that we address sexuality with children who have disclosed these things needs to really be looked at, because I think, we owe it to these kids who, if they're brave enough to say, I have a problem, I think I'm turned on by, the sight of a dead woman, what are we going to do to help get them the resources and the mental health care? And that's really, this is not we're trying to shame people who have this, part of their life, but we also want it to stop because it does lead to murder. So I know you said you had other questions.
Let's see, what was my other one? Oh no, that's my brain. I don't remember.
I'm just thinking about the things we're seeing currently in the news related to the things being taught in the public schools to children about sexuality. And there are fine lines sometimes. It's very disturbing to me. Again, why do very young children need to hear this whole gamut? It's one thing to be accepting of how other people are feeling,
Right.
versus
All grooming.
There's
All for the future.
There's very fine lines there that are being, sounds like to me, or I don't have young children right now, but sounds like they're being crossed. It's very disturbing.
It is disturbing, and we just, there's not great research about this particular topic anyway, and there's very conflicting views, because there will be some researchers who will tell you, oh, in some countries, violent pornography it's perfectly fine and legal, and we have less violence. There are those studies, but then you look at other studies and you hear from the mouths of serial killers themselves about what violent pornography played in their life. And I believe, and I know firsthand from work that I've done for the past 15 months, what happens when you spend that kind of time in those communities. So a good example I can give you is mine. Now, obviously, I don't have a death fetish, and I'm appalled by it. But because I spent so much time undercover, it has changed me as a person. For me, it's anxiety. It's fear. It's, the advocacy too. But it put this dark cloud around my life, because you start becoming suspicious of everybody that you come in contact with. I mean, a good example is that I went to a book signing in Ozark, and a guy came and he talked to me and he wanted to touch my hair. And I do not touch me, right? And then I had a book signing the next week in Van Buren, and he came to that book signing too. And I was just a wreck. And it turns out he's a super fan, and that's great, and I'm so grateful that he bought the books and he cares about the case. But of course, then I just go to a place of fear. So for me, it changed me, because I'm not typically a fearful person. So if you already have this predisposition to have interest in rape and murder and other things, and you're spending all your time in these websites, you're going to think that's okay. You're going to put yourself in situations where you might be able to see how far you could take it. Well, I'm going to try to pretend to strangle her during a sex act. You know, it does grow from there. It's extremely frightening.
Starts out very suddenly. I mean, you have a president of the United States who can't walk up and shake a little girl's hand, but he has to lean over her and smell her hair, put his hands on her shoulder, and that right there is a little bit of control, in a position, in a posture, so that he can bend over, and he openly discusses it.
And there's
That's
just,
the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you're seeing a fetish
Are willing to do
unfold
things
on
in
TV.
public, what are you doing in private?
Sure.
yeah, it's death fetish is very dangerous. It's very scary. You know, we still have lots to say about this topic through the podcast. We're going to continue to expose the producers, mainly because that's not doxing them. If you have a business license to run your business, it's public.
That's what I was going to ask. Okay, if you have to get a business license to do these things, and are they like really legit business licenses?
Some of them are, believe it or not. Some of them are running under the radar. But what they've done is, so we found a loophole, which we were excited about, is that credit card companies and PayPal are not going to allow those transactions to go through, and they will pull your merchant account if they find out you're selling death fetish. And so for us, we're like, yes, we're going to start turning all that in. The problem is a lot of these places are turning to cryptocurrency as quickly as possible. And they can't, and they have offshore accounts that they're using. But it's, you know, death fetish is big business. And that's why some of these people are targeting us, because we are threatening their livelihood. And it spills into those, you know, some of the sites that we were a part of for our investigative work were really considered the soft sites. If you can believe that, because, you know, like a death fetish net, that's pretty scary. I mean, I won't even talk about the things that go on in there. It's too disturbing. But there's other places, like they talk about crucifying women. Just really hard, those are considered hardcore sites, and we wouldn't go to those. A bulk of what we needed because of that suspect was in some of the other, like femme fatalities, fete noir, deadly desires, you know, those kind of things. But you can see clips of what they're making, and then they send you to another gated community so you can actually buy the film. So it's quite the little maze of here's how they're getting away with it. And one of our interviews, if you listen to the podcast, is we interviewed a death fetish producer. He came on the show. And some people love it and some people hate it, because I was really hostile with him. I was bad cop. Alecia was good cop. But I also know he's raped some women. And, you know, when I have gone and flown to different cities to talk to these women, these models that are in hiding, that don't want to be a part of death fetish anymore, and they tell me, well, this producer took it too far. He almost killed me. He drugged me. He raped me. You know, you start to see a pattern here. Mm-hmm. And that episode, you'll see that he admits that they pushed some people too far, and he admits that what they're doing is not legal. And I have to say that carefully, because, like in Oregon, it is legal. There are no rules around it. But you have to look at those federal laws, again, on a case-by-case basis to determine if they're going to be held accountable for that particular film. So
You would be surprised if you knew there was a serious effort from drug cartels to get involved in this. They're already human smuggling, human trafficking. This is just another venture. The minute that they realize what kind of a market there is for that those narco dollars will just pick up another dimension to their business. They're already looking for everything they can. All the money or drugs go north, the trafficking goes north, the human trafficking, all the money goes south. Yeah. It's a failed narco state. Tell me that you don't have public officials who are profiting from the transactions going on.
Absolutely.
With all those illegalities. I mean, seriously, we have people who are just covering up, and we vote for people who are putting a lot of that money in their pocket.
Well, I guarantee you, we voted for people that are part of these communities.
Oh, yes.
One of the things that we've done too, and I'm about out of time, is we took all the screen names that we could, and then we cross-matched it with just a simple Google search to see if they were using those screen names anywhere else, and some of them are. And so then, I got his identity. Oh my gosh, he's a pediatrician in this city, because they don't think to use a different screen name. And so that helped us kind of get an idea of what we were looking at. And there's some high-profile cases that I think are connected to death fetish that I'll just really quickly. Almost everybody, I think, by this point knows about the Stephen Avery case, The Making of a Murderer on Netflix. And, he had a family member, Bobby Dassey, who I personally believe Bobby Dassey killed Teresa Halbach. And the reason I feel that way is because when they pulled Bobby Dassey's computer, he had so much death fetish pornography on his computer. I mean, thousands of images. And he's in those communities. I look for him. But some of the screen names, they're smart, and it's hard to figure out who they are. But those are just, some examples. So we're not going to stop. We'll continue, like I said, with our efforts. We're starting a petition, and then we're just trying to go to as many speaking engagements as we can and talking about death fetish, and in hopes that, we can bring some, I think, awareness, and at the same time help people to understand that it can touch your community. It did. It touched the case of Melissa Witt from the River Valley. Whether there's a connection there for sure or not, we haven't been able to prove that, but it is a tip that came in. It's happening in your own backyard. So thank you for being here today. I know it's not a huge crowd, but I really appreciate it. But thank you. I think I did this last time, so I'm going to give copies of this book to the people that came today. So Alecia signed it. She had to fly out to the Virgin Islands, but if you want to come to the back, if you would like a copy, I will also sign it too, and you can take a copy with you today. And then I wanted to leave some for the library.
Okay, yes,
too.
that sounds appreciated.
Thank you for allowing me to come today.